Hello everyone, today I want to start with the first video of the Roman army series and talk about the Limitanei. I want to provide a sort of introductory video about these late Roman army troops, about which there are, I think, still a lot of misconceptions. One of the greatest and hardest prejudices to get over with especially mass culture, is this idea that late Roman army was something weaker than one of the previous centuries. There is nothing of more false of this conception, as historiography about the Roman military machine has at this point long since proved, and the Limitanei especially, so the kind of stationary troops that were deployed, and we will be seeing this today along especially the frontiers from which they take their name, suffer increasingly even of the stereotype, because they are considered, compared to the mobile army of the comitatenses and of the Palatine troops, as a sort of weaker militia that wasn't good as the other legionnaires. But today we will try to challenge this stereotype. First of all, I would like to make a bit of an introduction of background, because the differentiation between the so-called mobile and stationary troops is something that we start seeing substantially since the 3rd century. I mean, the 3rd century was this moment in which the Roman Empire forces were put in motion to the usually stationary deployments that they had along the borders of the empire. And there is a sharp increase of the divisions of certain troops that had to remain locally, guarding the boundaries in the empire, and those who would kind of make back and forth from every angle of the empire to meet with the more intense threats coming from outside the border, or at this time in the 3rd century actually within them, because we see a huge amount of civil wars between the same Romans. And there is, first of all, here a continuity of that Limitanei represent, along with the Roman tradition of safeguarding their the borders, because objectively before the 3rd century almost all the Roman forces, the legions, were deployed along the borders. So what we find with the Limitanei in the late Roman times is essentially a continuation of the deployment of troops on these frontiers for meeting the the most immediate threats that were often relatively the smallest ones. We're talking about little raids that could even be stopped by a relatively contained amount of troops. And in this sense, we find even before the actual administrative division between comitatenses and Limitanei, in the Roman sources, the word Limitanei was to actually tell those troops that to describe those troops that were on the limes, as a matter of fact. And so the whole concept, this is what I care about, was not new. And however, it's only during the 4th century, so especially with the Constantinian military reforms and the general reorganization of not just of Roman military but of the whole Roman society, that the difference between these troops becomes something also technical and administrative at the same time. So, as we were saying, during Constantine times were founded the comitatenses troops that included also the the Scolae Palatinae, or Scole Palatinae as you want to call them. So the imperial guards in substance, and the Limitanei that, however, being largely deployed on fluvial borders, like especially the one of the Rhine and of the Danube, that saw pretty intense warfare at the time, they were also called, firstly I'd say, as ripenses or riparienses, which ripa means river in Latin, so these were it was substantivized adjective that meant those guys were technically on the rivers. So the first evidence, at least that I remember of, that we have of this technical and administrative distinction is dated to 325 in a law that for the first time mentioned the comitatenses, while the excuse me, the frontier troops were called ripenses, as a matter of fact. And after this premise, let's go to debunk substantially the stereotype that Limitanei were this kind of B-series troops, although obviously I don't want to stress too much, because you know, as if these were equal to the comitatenses one. Obviously there were differences, and we will be seeing how, especially during the time, things started to change a little bit in the negative sense. But just because there was, especially around the 5th century, especially in the West, a steady decline of the Roman state and incidentally of the Roman army. In the East, the Eastern Roman Empire, things go differently, because that was it was founded on other bases that allowed the moment of crisis to be passed. But definitely there was a regression during the centuries, even after that. I mean, the Limitanei as such, with this name, survived actually even during the 5th or 6th century. So we go towards a time of crisis, especially during the second half of the 6th century, so that the whole Roman society was changing, and the military also reacted accordingly. But let's say that, especially for the 4th century, and this is what I want to talk about today, the difference between comitatenses and Limitanei are often lesser than what we actually expect. So first of all, we have to remember that since the early empire, since the Principate, there had always been a tendency of the Roman troops deployed, especially in the frontiers, to kind of sedentarize and to grow rooted, let's say, in the local environment. We know of soldiers intermarrying with local women, even bringing them into their barracks, something for which I think under Septimius Severus it was a law that prohibited that because of discipline, etc. So there would be objectively, especially in the early, after the definitive stabilization of the geographical stabilization of the borders during the 2nd century, the idea that legions stationed in a certain city would remain there for even for generations. I mean, there wasn't much of a movement. There weren't such great threats at that time in Roman history to see a lot of military activity on the frontiers. As a matter of fact, the soldier's life at the heyday of the Roman Empire was definitely not very risky. If you look at the mortality rates, they were extremely low compared to, I don't know, the one of the 3rd century or even the one of the civil wars during the late Republic. So it would be normal that a lot of time would be spent by the legionaries living among civilians and doing very civil activities next to the military ones. And we know that because we have even the actually schedules of these guys' works that implied, a certain time of free time to go, and the military, the settlement, the Roman forts had increasingly um, contributed to develop the local communities. Most of these centers would become with time uh, fortified cities, and therefore they wouldn't be inhabited just by the legionaries, but by the also by the local population. So what is normally what the Limitanei are usually accused of is having had this kind of lazy minded horizons in a certain sense. That means that they weren't the usual soldiers that were always on the march somewhere on the frontier fighting the barbarians, but that they prefer to stay at home and doing other things. Well, all soldiers prefer to do that, telling the truth. And you could say, in fact, as I was saying, the same thing for the legionaries deployed on the frontiers. They weren't doing much. I mean, probably the life of a Limitanus in the third century was, in the fourth century was something much more, dynamic and unpredictable than the life of a legionnaire on the in Spain during the or even on the Danube during the first century AD. So it's really relative, the idea that the Limitanus was preferably tied to the local dimension and didn't care much about the military involvement, and this is actually false. As it is false, the concept that Limitanei were in reality a sort of peasantry that was called up in times of need, just like other communities. Because telling the truth, we do find this form of organizations in warfare all over history, especially if you look at the Middle Ages. That were a very highly militarized society. You find there were peasant communities that were called every once in a while to provide with arms and then going back working land. Well, this was not definitely the case of the Limitanei. First of all, for all the 4th century, there is no historical evidence at all that stattal lands were assigned to the Limitanei to live in them. The only exception is made up by Africa, the African frontier, that however was a bit different because the African border was a bit less troubled this time than the Danubian or Rhine one, or even the one with Sassanid Persia. So, and there would be also much less threatening peoples on the African border. So, it would be, normal that certain people living there preferred to get a piece of land and staying there as essentially as colonists, because this is something very old since the Hellenistic era. And there had been the concept both in the Hellenistic kingdoms and in the Roman Republic to have colonists to be sent somewhere, living in a place, and actually this happened with for instance, with the colonies of Roman Right, that they were exempted for the local Roman citizens would be exempted at that point of active military service, because having been sent in that place as colonists that were usually the more troubled frontiers would equate as a military service in itself. Here the situation in Africa was probably similar, and also in here it doesn't mean that the Limitanei were lazy people staying there, just minding their own business and not participating to war. Actually, during the 4th century, it was a quite strict discipline and order and framing of the military into the statal machine that was arguably even superior than the one of previous centuries. But Africa, I repeat, that is an exception. Is an exception as a frontier in the Roman Empire, and it is an exception also for this land assignment to the Limitanei. So there is actually a great a big difference that tells you how, administratively speaking, the Limitanei were conceived as soldiers. It's all about the annona. The annona it was essentially a taxation in nature that was devolved directly to the army. It is something that existed since a long time, but during the 4th century, with the Constantinian reforms, is something that begins to take more of a more of a dimension, because there was a contraction of monetary circulation. The cities were kind of partly declining compared to previous centuries, so nature goods were slowly turning to be the most the most common way of paying the army. And the annona was a strictly military thing, and we know that the Limitanei received the annona just as like the comitatenses, maybe with just one difference that, however, doesn't prove anything against their military qualities. That while the comitatenses generally got the annona in nature, so in natural goods or possibility to acquire them somewhere, the Limitanei's annona was essentially given partially or even completely sometimes into coins, into money. And this seems interesting because during the 5th century, so 100 years later, the assignation of land to the Limitanei actually starts instead, compared to the 4th century, and this was progressively, let's say, compensating the the decreasement of the annona. And this is also not an indicator of the military qualities of the Limitanei, but rather the picture of a broader picture of how the things in the Roman Empire were starting to turn, because the 5th century is not an easy one. Actually, the army does suffer in the 5th century some kind of regression, especially in the West. While during the 4th century it hadn't been the case. And not even in the 5th century, although we can talk about of the Limitaneus as essentially a peasant in this sense, because we actually know, we're pretty well documented about this, in the sense that the local terrains that were sold to the Limitanei, that were given to the Limitanei as a pay, would be already at that still at that time quite largely object of sale. I mean, there was a pretty active market of these terrains, which meant that many Limitanei didn't care about settling down in them, and they would simply sell them to someone that could pay for them, and the state essentially didn't care. They just tell them, look, that land is yours, then do whatever you want with that. We are not going to provide you with money, which is a very clever thing basically to avoid a lot of expenses in bureaucracy and in the point of actually paying the military man. It was something much more spontaneous. And consider also that during the 5th century, a lot of lands of the empire were within the same imperial borders were pretty much depopulated. So this is the same century in which the Federati, so these allies, mostly Germanic people, were made settling into the Roman borders, into these depopulated areas. And the Limitanei, even in this context, instead seem to be a bit more Roman-like. I mean, they were still part of a monetary economy that could, and they seemingly had a mindset that that didn't want, in fact, to settle down, but to have money to invest somewhere else, to live still into the probably into the urban world, or to go take land elsewhere at that point. There is really no evidence to support the idea that Limitanei was less professional than the average of the Roman military at the time. And we have to think that, as I was saying before, they still saw a pretty good amount of action during these times, because they had definitely a secondary role, let's say better, a less prestigious role, but not definitely secondary if you think about the majority of operations that were led, because their role was to essentially wage a defensive warfare and blocking enemy incursions of small or middle entity, and to slow down their operation even on a larger scale, by exploiting all these net of fortified structures that were scattered all around the Limes area. And this is very important because it makes you think how still a lot of infrastructures existed at that time along the border, probably even more than in the previous centuries. And in order to practice what is called this defense in depth, which basically meant to stop the enemy by bogging him down, essentially, once that he entered into the Roman territory with guerrilla tactics and war of attrition. Therefore, were pretty, complex operations. They implied, first of all, the knowledge of the local territory, which really tells you at that point how valuable the Limitanei actually were. And plus, it actually also takes a lot of tactical and technical ability, in the sense that guerrilla is really a strong form of war, and it takes a lot of boldness, a lot of quick decision making, and it implies also a kind of warfare that that you don't learn about if not through really good experience, because getting into a mobile army with the comitatenses and being told to fight essentially in formations in open field, etc., which wasn't only what the comitatenses did, we will be seeing this now, but essentially it was about it. Guerrilla warfare is something that takes a lot of actually also practical experience and a lot of other abilities that are difficult to actually give into professional training, like even so advanced like the Roman one was. So many of the wars that the Romans won at this time by fencing off barbarian invasions, incursions, were actually the Limitanei played in these a very active and an important role, because the mobile army often arrived when the enemy was already softened up by attrition, carried out by the Limitanei, and quite simply they would run away once that the comitatenses would arrive, and the Limitanei still at that point would be pursuing and harassing them and doing a lot of things that practically meant, aside from the deterrents represented by the field army, practically most of the job. And if you look that into historical perspective, telling the truth, it had always been so. And in previous centuries, well, also in the 4th century, in the 5th century, this happened, but especially during the time of the early empire, you see that this role was which was a less prestigious one, because they didn't win the big pitched battles, you know, these great glorious events that everybody would remember, but the legionaries would come on open field only after that the auxiliaries had prepared, let's say, the path for them. So and that thing was done normally by non-Romans. That was done by auxilia drawn from other peoples. You know, all the time during the Roman history of the Republic and the early empire, actually the majority of the Roman army was made up of non-Roman citizens, who incidentally were destined exactly to these supposedly secondary roles, but that really made up their muscles in them, and through which they could even aspire to citizenship at a point. Well, since the 4th century, these Limitanei were actually proper Roman citizens, so in a way you can even see a progress into the Roman army by deputing actual Roman guys to perform these duties, obviously together with the auxiliaries, or the federati, like, as you want to call them, that were still part, heavily part of the Roman army at this time. But it's still very interesting, because frontier warfare was quite of a thing in the 4th century. So still the Romans decided to rely on such local garrisons and the troops to you know, to defend their limites. And we can make an example here, that is during the wars waged by Constance Constance II, the Roman emperor, that lived that ruled better since the from the end of the 30s to the beginning of the 60s of the 4th century, and that had to fight for a long time in the west because of the usurper Magnentius that had rebelled into the western provinces, and also because of the pretty messed up situation on the Danube. And while he was in west, the eastern frontier, that was also a pretty hot one, because of the presence of the Sassanid emperor Shapur and his mighty armies. It was really the Limitanei, obviously with the integration of certain mobile troops that, however, were very few at that point on the eastern frontier, to sustain the enemy pressure on that sector, and basically bogging down the Sassanid army, the Sassanid armies between all these Roman fortresses that existed into Mesopotamia and made up the eastern limes, and to basically carry out a war of attrition that was mostly fought in sieges and kind of raids and stuff like that, and which was definitely so successful that the Tigris frontier basically remained intact until the arrival of the emperor. So the and in this sense, we don't have to think of the Limitanei as something monolithic, like there was a kind of tactical standard for them to be, I don't know, just light infantry or other things like some people believe. First of all, in the Roman army, the idea of the interchangeability of weapons and equipment had always been present at every age, which means that you could find a Limitaneus to be heavily armored as much as a Comitatensis legionary. And the same thing goes accordingly with the kind of tactical operations that they had to carry out. So we have to think of the malleability and flexibility of these troops, and not as a kind of A or B series type of. And it would be also obvious that as it happens in any war in history all the time, that there is no army that is equal to another, that there is no battle that is equal to another. So things constantly change. It can also evolve towards differentiated forms of organization on a particular military theater, into which the local troops can even reconvert themselves into something else. And this is definitely something that Limitanei did, as much as we know. And there is also another interesting aspect to add, but I will talk about that extensively in another video. That is the kind of multiple specialties that the 4th century Roman army was actually capable of. And in the sense that from the 4th century onwards, the military training of the individual legionaries actually saw a great increase, a greater specialization. People think that this is a moment of regression. Not at all. Soldiers at this point would be trained to fight essentially with every weapon. And you can argue this was true also in the previous times, because even for the, let's say, iconic Roman legionary equipped with the scale armor and gladius and pilum and quadrangular shield, I mean, it wouldn't be so strange to use other form of weapons if the tactical situation required that. Heavy legionary infantry in all during the time of all Roman history could be able to perform any kind of duty, even as light infantry. So telling the truth, the 4th century, this kind of polymatic aspect of the Roman legionary is quite strongly emphasized. We see even the appearance of new weapons and equipment. There was actually also technological development in the 4th century that was due to the new and much worse threats that now the Romans were meeting with the Alemanni or the Sassanids, the frontiers, that were for which there had not been need in the previous centuries. So never underestimate 4th century army, because the myth of the inferiority is actually pretty evident, and for what we know, it's even possibly that the 4th century army, Roman army, was actually more developed and effective than the one of the previous centuries from a tactical point of view. And the interchangeability of these of the Limitanei is actually seen into the integration that is historically documented of Limitanei into mobile armies. And there was a kind of designation that was called into the sources pseudo-comitatenses that was attributed to the Limitanei, meaning that basically these were guys who came from the Ripenses or Riparienses or Limitanei, but they were converted, maybe temporarily, to serve as comitatenses as well. So this tells you really how dynamic the whole thing actually was, and it had always been normal, telling the truth, to aggregate various types of troops to legions since very early time. At this point, when you have to wage mass-scale invasion, you kind of think even at the organizational difficulties, and the more you have, if it is probably covered by logistics, etc., the better it is. And we know that during the 4th century, it was very important to have even this kind of lighter and more flexible troops around the core of the field army, and definitely the Limitanei, especially if they were used to this frontier warfare, would be an excellent force to cover that role. And we know, as a matter of fact, that during the march of Julian's army, during the beginning of his unfortunately unlucky, I'll say so, Persian campaign, the rear guard of his invasion force was commanded by the Dux Osroene, or Osroene, as you want to call it, and was made up by troops of Limitanei that came from that frontier district. So that really tells you, that was a very big invasion. It was supposed basically to crush Persia, and it would have succeeded if Julian had not died. Well, that big force had a rear guard made up, by Limitanei, and rear guards, is something you have to put a lot of trust and confidence in, usually, especially with this kind of enemies like the Persians that were quite skilled in ambushes and stuff like that. So, quite simply, never underestimate Limitanei. There is, although, now I wanted to stress, obviously, I said that explicitly, the relativity of the differentiations between comitatenses and Limitanei, but there were, as a matter of fact, and they would increase over time. So, first of all, there was an idea that there had always been the idea that the comitatenses represented a sort of higher rank troops compared to the Limitanei, which didn't really mean, you don't have to see that as we have seen in perspective of actual professionalism. Because there is no evidence to point it out. But the point is that the comitatenses had to, they had to be used in a greater, in a more diverse pool of roles, either strategical and tactical. The comitatenses essentially could fight in every circumstance, where it was an invasion or a defense. They could stay even beyond the limits for a very long time. They could fight as well into minor clashes, into ambushes and stuff like that, as well as into pitched battles, the ones that brought fame and glory to the emperors and their generals. They had to wage sieges and to be skilled in guerrilla warfare. Remember the training that increases also for the legionaries at this point, and all the problems coming from long marches in hostile territory, the logistical problems. It's the military engineering that was required at that point. And in this sense, the life of a comitatensis was arguably much, on average at least, much worse than one of a Limitaneius in many ways. For instance, at the end of the campaigns, the comitatensis didn't even have a place like a barrack where to come back to. I mean, the Limitaneius knew that he lived on that area of the frontier that maybe could be a living hell, I don't know, but it kind of had a support on local resources. The Comitatenses was a much more um, globetrotter in a way, in many ways, and we know actually, by even by letters of recommendation of the time, that the guys who enrolled were preferred into the army, were preferred to be part of the Limitanei rather than the Comitatenses, which is not something you would really expect, because you say, well, but um, that was more prestigious. Well, this tells you that it was not the case, because it could be more prestigious in propaganda of glory and all this stuff, but in practical life, the Limitanei's life was the Limitanei's service was much more preferable than the one of Comitatenses. It's like going into I don't want to stress that too much, but if you go into a special force that has to break its back all the day, and if you can instead choose to be living in a barracks stationarily, you would do the same, the second option most of the times. And I'm not sure about this, but I believe that the mortality in the Comitatenses ranks was on average higher. Also probably because they were employed into more risky and bloody affairs than what they had happened usually for the Limitanei, or more direct clashes and contacts with dangerous situations. So there would be, however, in this sense, certain compensations, because for making people join, because also another problem here at this point was that there was a shortage of manpower, so even the recruitment was a kind of a problem at this point. And the Comitatenses, because of their uncomfortable life, would have certain privileges of exemption from especially from taxes, that this during the 4th century start becoming something very much heavier and much more sure in many ways for a Roman citizen than the previous centuries. And we know there was a law of 372 that basically was punishing quite harshly the sons of those Comitatenses veterans who were trying to be part of the Limitanei by stashing themselves and hiding to those troops, because, by the way, at this time the what your father profession is what you inherited. If your father was a Comitatensis veteran, you had to become a Comitatensis soldier. So it was also a very deep commitment, really. It's not even a matter of a choice in many cases, and that opens really to the evolution of the differences between the Comitatenses and the Limitanei, that definitely increased over time, also because of this sharp social divisions that would start to be even legally sanctioned by in the Constantinian world, and that would really transform the structure of the empire, especially in the East, towards a certain direction. There is, however, a perception even that we can't stress as factual reality, that has to do mostly with which is important anyway, because I think it's Ammianus Marcellinus who says that around the half of the 4th century, that basically the Comitatenses weren't more capable anymore of performing defensive duties. You know, they were evolving towards a really field army in many ways, where the Limitanei were essentially always more enclosed into their local sector, and they wouldn't venture more than that. So during the 5th century, it's plausible that this situation had developed further at the point that there was indeed, as we've seen, maybe a greater local rooting of the Limitanei in the local areas, in the local communities. And this is also supported seemingly by the same Roman laws, which basically stress that who was part of the Limitanei couldn't go into the Comitatenses and vice versa anymore. So there couldn't even be those troop transfers that we could see during the 4th century with the pseudo-Comitatenses who were Limitanei temporarily transferred into the Comitatenses organics and roles. So indeed, this is mostly thought, obviously, as an explanation for the 4th century army. That is an army that actually functioned pretty well at that point and that achieved really great results during the century. It's probably just from Valentinian onwards things start to change, but Constantinian army was a hell of a military machine, and we can't really talk bad about it. So I would like really to make you reflect on this point, and I hope I also shed some light maybe for someone on the Limitanei. But these are all things that you can easily find in any history book about the Roman army, Roman warfare. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I planned from now on to talk more about the Roman army because I noticed that people are more interested. I began talking on this channel essentially about medieval history initially because I wanted to make a bit of a number of videos, and that was easier for me. But I'm also very passionate about the Roman army, and although I'm not a real expert academically, I think I can provide certain questions. If you have any question, of course you can suggest. I can talk about. You know, why not? If I can answer, I would be glad to do so. So if you like this video, please share it, or otherwise just leave a like or subscribe to my channel. And as always, I thank you very much heartily for listening to me. For now, I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.